Welcome back for the second panel we have today. My name is Mozelle Thompson. I'm on the board of the Media Access Project. Happy to work with Andy and everybody else from MAP back there. And I'm glad to see as many people come out today. Thank you, that's my chairman. To talk about some of these issues. And it's not easy. This is an area that I've worked in for a little while, but we also have a great panel of speakers here today. And I will begin by introducing them. To my right is Ben Scott, who's policy advisor for innovation for the Office of the Secretary at the State Department. You may also know him from his time running the Washington Office of Free Press, and that he is certainly at the cutting edge of the issues that we've heard about this morning. And to my far left is Bob Borsten, who's Director of Corporate and Policy Communications at Google. He's been a writer and an advisor to many, including Secretary of Treasury Rubin and Secretary of State Warren Christopher, and he's been also working in this issue for quite a long time. We have to my right Cynthia Wong, who's the director of the Project of Global Internet Freedom at CDT, the Center for Democracy and Technology. And she, among other things, she not only works on international free expression and human rights, but she's co-chair of the Policy and Learning and Communications Committee of GNI. And to my left is Mark McCarthy, who's VP for Public Policy Software for the Software and Information Industry Association and adjunct professor at Georgetown. He's had a long and distinguished career. I know him from his time representing Visa, and he's represented ABC, Cap Cities, and he's also has some Hill experience. So we have some good people here today. I thought a good place to start, because I don't like people to come to the party and feel like they didn't get a chance to get their message out. To give people here on the panel maybe a few minutes to talk about what they do and what they think it's important for the audience to know about. So let's start from the government. They're here to help us.
Well, thank you. Let me start by thanking the Media Access Project for the invitation to be here today, and my old friend Andy Schwartzman in particular, who is not only a mentor to me, but I think a mentor to every young advocate who comes up in the telecommunications policy space here in Washington. At some point, learn something important from Andy Schwartzman. So let me say, I know a lot of you from my past life at Free Press. And my father-in-law recently asked me to describe the most important difference between my previous job and my current job. And I told him, when I was at Free Press, I talked in public for a living. And now that I'm at the State Department, I talk in private for a living. So now I get an opportunity to come back and speak more in my old stomping grounds, and it's a pleasure to be here. My current job is a relatively straightforward one on paper, but tends to be more complicated in practice. I sit in a small group of advisors to the Secretary of State, looking at questions of technology and statecraft, which turns out to be a sort of choose-your-own-adventure of a brave new world in foreign policy and international relations in the wake of both WikiLeaks and the Arab Spring, as virtually everyone has woken up to the fact that the internet matters and to foreign policy, and has been incredibly disruptive to our conventional notions of international relations and the practices of statecraft that we deploy to respond to those changes. With respect to internet freedom, I think one of the most important thing that I want to put on the table to begin is what a sea change it was in foreign policy circles when Hillary Clinton put this issue on the table in January of 2010. She's since given 3 major speeches on internet freedom. At the time when she first put this issue on the map, it was relatively obscure. No sitting Secretary of State had ever given such a prominent place to internet freedom in the priority list of foreign policy issues. She's since really elevated it across the board and attracted enormous amounts of interest in internet freedom across the world, not simply amongst the usual suspects in terms of our European allies, but also in South America and Africa and Asia. This is an issue that no one can ignore anymore. There's debates about it, of course, but we're all now organized around a discussion of how to understand the importance of internet freedom in modern international relations. And I think that marks a very important change. And for me, as someone new to bureaucracies and new to large institutions, watching the institution adapt and adopt this new idea and put it into practice at the speed at which the State Department has done has really been remarkable and unique among any other issue that I've seen in foreign policy since I've been in government. And that's not just a view of self-interested fans of Hillary Clinton like I am. That's the view of my counterparts in foreign capitals all over the world, where I go and people ask us, where did this come from? How are you working on internet freedom? From what principles is this policy derived? What are your programmatic elements? How are you advancing the cause of internet freedom in the world? So it is really making an impact globally. And I think that part of the reason we're here having a discussion about internet freedom is because of how fast and how prominently it was elevated by the Secretary of State. So I'll stop there and hand the baton.
Good. Bob?
Thank you, Mozelle, and thank you to Media Access Project and to Pew for loaning us this very white space. It's amazing looking around here.
It's a white box discussion.
Oh, right, okay.
So
I feel like everything is a whiteboard. I guess that I will follow upon what Ben said by getting to trying to characterize what's going on globally in the area of internet freedom. And I will do this in a very simplistic fashion, knowing that that will get me into trouble, but nonetheless thinking that maybe that will start a good discussion, because I'd rather have a discussion than lecture. I would like to divide the world into three types of regimes when it comes to online freedom, online free expression, free flow of information across national borders. On the one side, let's say that there are the Swedens and the Netherlands and the United States for the most part. Let's forget little incidents like SOPA and PIPA, and say that those countries are committed to online freedom. On the other extreme, there are the Chinas and the Russias and the Irans and the Syrias and the miserable crew. And let's say that they are committed to doing anything possible to control information on the internet. The countries that I'm most concerned with in the next couple of years and that I think are most worth looking at are those in the middle. The Brazils and the Indias and the Argentinas and the Chiles and the North African countries and Southeast Asian like Indonesia and the Philippines. And the question I want to put on the table is, which way are they going to go? Are they going to go what I would hope to be and what I would characterize as the right way, that is the way of the Swedens and the Netherlands and the US, or are they going to go the wrong way and try to clamp down on information and try to control the free flow of something that will probably prove extraordinarily important to their own economic growth, in addition to giving people in those countries an outlet, a platform for social and economic change and political change ultimately. That's the question that I'm focused on at the moment, and I thought I'd put it out on the table.
Thanks. Cynthia?
Sure. So for those of you who don't know CDT, we are a civil liberties organization that focuses on the internet. And that pretty much means we work on a wide range of policy issues. my particular job there, among other things, is to identify other NGOs, other partners, especially in those countries in the middle that Bob just pointed out, who are also working on internet policy and trying to maintain an open and free internet. And to partner with those organizations so that we can support each other, so that we can share best practice, and so that we can ensure that the internet that we have tomorrow is still one that is open and free and supportive of human rights. I guess there's a few points I would just make initially, which is that I think the open and free internet that we kind of take for granted here in the West didn't come about by accident. And it was actually the result of very specific choices around policy and governance that were made early in its days. And so I think that's important to remember. And I can elaborate on some of these policies, but it's things like promoting user trust through privacy regulation. It's things like protecting internet intermediaries so that they can provide platforms for user expression, intermediaries like search engines and social media platforms. And it's things like emphasizing user control and user empowerment as a way to deal with offensive content online instead of resorting to more top-down government controls. And so there is a set of best practices that gave rise to the internet we know today. The biggest challenge we face here in the US and other governments are facing as well is how to deal with the bad uses of the internet, like cybercrime or hate speech, without undoing what made the internet open and free to begin with. So as we saw in the aftermath of the UK riots last year, there was some grumbling around, well, in the cases of future unrest, maybe we need some mechanism to block social media sites since they are used to organize protests. And I think that civil society and others successfully argued back that that is not a proportional or democratic way or mechanism to deal with unrest, that there's more proportional ways of dealing with that. And finally, the last thing I'll say, and I can elaborate on this more, is that, well, how do we meet that challenge? How do we figure out how to deal with cybercrime, deal with intellectual property infringement without undoing the open internet? Well, I think that there's a need to return to those first principles to really re-examine what gave rise to the free and open internet and figure out what are the best practices that will work now, given the way the technology has moving forward. And I would say there's a couple of best practices that have been elaborated on the past year, like the OECD principles and the work of the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, Frank LaRue, that can give guidance to both civil society and government who are really struggling to maintain an open internet and maintain the economic growth that the internet brings while dealing with legitimate social issues.
Thank you. Mark?
So thank you, Mozelle, and thanks to Andy and Tamira for inviting me here. This is a good panel. I'm happy to be part of it. I want to talk about the issue of internet freedom from a slightly different perspective. Hillary Clinton launched it. I think Ben is right that she really put the issue on the table. But she framed it as a foreign policy and as a human rights issue, and as something that's consistent with our own respect for the First Amendment and for the UN Declaration of Human Rights. But it's also an economic issue and a trade issue. And Bob sort of mentioned that in passing. And there have been a number of developments since that time that take that tack. One is the development of these principles at the OECD that Cynthia mentioned, the principles for internet governance, which call on governments to respect the openness of the internet, not simply as a matter of human rights and foreign policy, but also as a driver of economic growth. The second development has been a set of principles endorsed by industry groups, the National Foreign Trade Council, SIIA, and a number of other organizations signed on to these principles of cross-border data flows that embody two principles that are crucial in this area of internet freedom. One is the idea that data should flow in an unrestricted fashion across borders. And the other is that governments, when they're involved in dealing with computer service providers, shouldn't require localization of facilities in order to provide the service in a local fashion. The third is a set of principles negotiated by USTR with their European counterparts, principles for the trade in ICT, information communications technology, which also embody the same two principles. So thinking of internet freedom as an economic and trade issue provides a different way of of approaching the issue that may bring extra resources to bear on accomplishing the opening that we're all looking for. How does that happen? Two areas. One, through the WTO, their commitments under GATS for open trade and services, and this applies to internet-based services. To the extent that a country has made that commitment, its efforts to keep out internet search engines or social media companies or microblogs or to impose restrictions on the flow of information across borders might very well be a violation of their GATS commitments and be subject to the WTO dispute resolution process. That's one area. The other is through trade negotiations. The U.S. is involved right now in some discussions with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a group of 9 countries that are looking forward to creating a Trans-Pacific regional trade agreement. And one of the issues that's been placed on the table is this issue of cross-border data flows. They've actually created a very interesting way of resolving the potential conflicts between privacy and data flows that I can talk about a little bit later if we want. But that's a second way of trying to deal with these issues through trade agreements that can then be spread through a network of other countries that are willing to act as more deeply integrated trade partners with us. It's that section of the issue as a trade issue that might relate to Bob's second group of people, actually third, the ones who are in the middle, the ones who are trying to figure out which way to go. For them, appeal to human rights and foreign policy considerations is powerful, but an appeal to their economic interest might provide an additional incentive for them to look favorably on an open and free flow of information on the internet. So that's my comment, and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, we're done. You can all go home. I thought this was interesting because it highlighted a couple of areas where I'm wondering if we're talking the same language or we're talking about the same thing. When we start talking about internet freedom, and then we talk about the free flow of information, is that the same thing? Because I hear these two different languages, but because that also says a lot about who gets to control information and what kind of information is being controlled. Do you think they're the same thing?
It's a really good question. I have taken to referring to things as the free flow of information, or specifically the free flow of information across national borders, if you're talking about specific problems. And the reason that I speak about it that way is because when you say free expression or online free expression, God forbid you ever say free speech, you immediately raise cultural barriers around the issue that need not be raised. And you also limit the number of people who are going to come in on your side. What do I mean by that? When you talk about free speech, you're obviously talking about censorship. And yes, we oppose censorship, that's fine. But it limits the number of people. It limits, for example, your appeal to financial companies who have come on board this set of principles that Mark was talking about that the National Foreign Trade Council put together. It limits whether manufacturers and people like that are also going to come in. And as far as I'm concerned, we need all the help we can get. That just having a couple of American-based, that is U.S.-based, I should say very carefully, U.S.-based companies and U.S.-based groups supporting this notion, that isn't going to be enough. And so when you cast the net wider and you use a different vocabulary in order to do that, I think it's an important difference. It may seem like a nuance, but let's not forget that once upon a time we referred to a certain trading status as most favored nation status. And then some very wise people decided to make that normal trade relations. And it eliminated a yearly battle in the Congress by doing that. And it was smart. And I hope that if we use the right vocabulary, we can draw in people from Southeast Asia, from North Africa, from Latin America, from places where our First Amendment is not kind of prime territory for discussion, and in fact, where a Made in the USA label and US values can turn people off rather than draw them into a cause.
If I could just build on that, I mean, I completely agree, and I think the words that you use will depend on the audience you're trying to convince. And I think we need to remember that, yes, the internet supports social movements, it supports political speech, but it also supports the right to education, right? It is an incredible tool for gaining access to knowledge, for gaining access to educational resources. It's an important tool for health, for gaining access to medical information. It's an important tool for investors and for local businesses to gain economic information. So I think that vocabulary really does help expand the notion of what the internet supports in terms of human rights or whatever interests you want to support.
I think there's a very specific reason why freedom of expression and the free flow of information are essentially the same thing in this space, and it's to do with the history of the political economy of information systems. We're at a very unique moment in time with respect to information systems from the policymaker standpoint. The way I look at it, there are three major information systems that have always underpinned modern societies. There's the information system that takes market information back and forth between buyers and sellers, which historically has been the same network that was the transportation network. When you sent goods across the ocean in the 18th century on a ship, you also sent the latest pricing information to your potential buyers on the other side. In the 20th century, that became railways, highways, skyways, and now increasingly that information is shared online. The second major information system, mass media. Obviously, we've seen major shifts from newspapers, radio, television, internet. Third major information system, personal communications. Postal service, telegraph, telephone, internet. Historically, policymakers have treated those information systems as entirely separate policy arenas. There is a body of law to deal with each of those that's quite different. And as those information systems have merged onto the same physical infrastructure, and policymakers have had to grapple with the fact that it's no longer possible to make those distinctions. There have been 30 years of debate at the FCC about how to deal with this in domestic telecom policy. It's the same problem that we're seeing in the international arena when, for the first time, policymakers have to decide how to deal with this information system, which, on the one hand, as Mark very correctly points out, is one of the key drivers of economic growth and development, while on the other hand is potentially disruptive when it comes to social and political discourse. Historically, that would have been no problem because you would have dealt with the mass media system and the personal communication system with a set of policies, and you would have dealt with your economic networks with a set of policies, and you could have kept them separate. Now you can't. The Secretary, in her second major speech on internet freedom, dealt with this specific question, which she calls the dictator's dilemma, which is how do you make policy in an environment where if you put your hand on the scale to control political speech on the internet, you are inevitably interfering with the free flow of ideas in the marketplace of innovation and entrepreneurship. How do you deal with that conundrum? And I think that's the question that speaks to Bob's sort of middle tier of countries as they begin to grapple with these questions.
Yeah. So let me jump in, and I think we're all in agreement that it's a nice equivalence to think about internet freedom and their free flow of information is sort of the same idea, but I think the translation does have some advantages. Bob mentioned some, that it brings in a larger audience. But it also makes it easier to deal with other competing policy issues. So one of the big arguments always in the free flow of information is how do you balance it against other competing interests like privacy, for example. And the discussions in TPP, for example, are illustrating a way to do that. The proposal that the U.S. has tabled there calls for these two principles of unrestricted flow of information and no localization requirements. But it recognizes that countries should be allowed to have their own domestic privacy regimes. They don't have to mimic the internal structure of the U.S. privacy regime in order to adopt the two principles of free information flow. But what is part of the agreement is the idea that global companies can comply with that local privacy regime in a demonstrable way. The idea that the information will simply be blocked and not allowed to be moved out of the country in order to comply with the privacy regime within the country is something that's ruled out by the agreement. So countries have to allow a global company to say, I comply with your local privacy regime in the following way. There's an enforceable code of conduct that I live up to. There are binding corporate rules that I live under. Or they could show that they live in a country where the rules for privacy regulation are equivalent to the domestic rules in the country that they're dealing with. That way of integrating privacy issues with the free flow of information makes both possible to achieve at the same time. And I think if we stayed at the level of simply saying free expression, we might not be able to see that way of bringing a compromise and a balance to the two sets of diverse policy interests.
But on the other hand, I wanted to throw this out there. I thought your three tiers, that was an interesting way of looking at it, except for the countries that are in this middle tier, that do you think that they are consciously aware that the decisions that they are making have are designed to have an influence on this larger thing that we call the internet that goes around all over the place? And do you think they care?
I think that they care first and foremost about their own national interests, whether those interests are economic or political or social or cultural, however they define those interests. And then I think they secondarily see that they can have an impact outside their borders. There is this, I don't know whether you would call it a farce, but it's certainly ironic that people refer to the internet as a borderless media. Because the last time I checked, every country within its borders has different laws that relate to the internet, which make it a lot more difficult to have kind of global principles and policies. Does it make it impossible? No, I would argue that it doesn't. And I'm going to go back to where Cynthia was with those OECD principles. And I think anybody who's interested in understanding where the internet is going to go, or rather where it should go, should take a look at that. Because it's a really interesting exercise. 35 countries come together, and they decided, I should say 35 governments come together.
Right.
And they decided at the end of a long process that governments should not be in charge. When was the last time that 35 governments came together about anything and decided they shouldn't be in charge? You tell me. I can't remember. And so I think they kind of got the essence of the internet, which is that it is a collaborative effort between NGOs, between individuals, between engineers, between the private sector, between people who work in the public sector. And they got the essence of the open internet right. And the principles that they came to build upon that essence, and in my mind anyway, allow us to continue to develop it in a way that will be positive in any number of realms over time. So on the one hand, I see the problems of nationalistic behavior every day. And it's something that my company faces every day when dealing with different governments. Those of you in this room who are educated in this area, and you're all probably better educated than I am, know about the troubles that have been having in India recently, that Google and Facebook and other companies have faced there. And that's the kind of thing that we're going to run up against all the time. The question is, will they come out in the defense of an open internet? And I think ultimately, thanks to economic questions primarily, that they will. Because they will recognize that without that free flow of information, they're going to stifle, if not strangle, their growth.
That's the great dilemma, is that the great opportunities brought by the internet for economic development bring with them necessarily the great vulnerabilities of the decentralization of power that network technologies implicitly bring to societies.
And that's the point that I think that is very
really well
interesting,
said.
because back in 2008, you posed this dilemma about the balance between free expression versus local authority. And if we look at what's happened since 2008, there's this whole deployment of new technologies that sort of flatten the pyramid, that actually give users a lot more control. And in some ways, one of the things that we're talking about is what are the vehicles, control vehicles we're using to give users control? Whether it's a global governance, or whether it's how individual countries tend to look at the internet. So I'm finding it kind of interesting that a lot of people talked this morning about the importance of individual rights and freedoms, but how much it's dictated by a lot of other factors that may not be directly obvious.
I think that's quite right. And you asked a question earlier, which I think is related, which is, how are countries in that middle tier thinking about these questions? And I think we have an erroneous tendency to project our own assumptions and our own familiarity with this debate onto other capital cities. And we forget the fact that in most of these middle countries, it's really only in the last 2 years, thanks to the smartphone, that significant percentages of their populations are online. And these questions of opportunity and vulnerability, which have been with us for many years and which we've grappled with and made our peace with according to our own legal histories and principles and the like, these are new questions in a lot of these countries. In India, the percentage of the population that's connected to the internet is still in the single digits. So it says two things to me. One is, a lot of these questions are new in a lot of governments, and their familiarity with them is not monolithic, and their views about them are not monolithic. And second, the tensions and the pressure for both to reap the rewards and control the vulnerabilities that come with network technologies are going to heighten as greater numbers of people get online. And both the inevitability of disruption and the promise of economic growth are realized in greater proportion.
Sure. So let me jump in and take the conversation in the direction that puts the focus on the internet intermediaries as a locus for problems. The way the issue is normally set up, it's governments that are the problem. They reach out to the Googles or the Facebooks or the YouTubes or the Twitters and say, here's what we want you to do to control activity or speech that they find to be problematic. And that's really an important issue. We've got to pay attention to this role of governments as censors and as entities that constrain economic activity. But the development I want to draw attention to is the development of what you might call a social conscience or social responsibility in the intermediaries themselves. I saw this at Visa when I was there. They went from a situation where they didn't want to do much to a situation where they were taking proactive efforts in the area of internet gambling, child pornography, online tobacco, online controlled substances, and other issues where it turned out that they felt as though they were doing the right thing by taking action to keep their systems clear of bad behavior. Since I left, they've also done additional steps. They've reached an agreement with some of the content providers on using financial instruments to control online copyright infringement. But more controversially, they took a step against the WikiLeaks in the situation where it looked as though they were leaking information that had national security implications, and they cut off the payment service to that entity. MasterCard did, sort of PayPal. The question that arises in that context is one, government action, because there was some suggestion that this was done at the behest of government, but also the accountability for that behavior. Along with social responsibility comes some need for social accountability, the transparency, the fair process, the openness of these kind of decisions is something that has yet to be adequately discussed. These are not simply private disputes between private business entities. They have huge implications for the development and the flow of information on the internet, because these entities do act as control points where if you don't have access to these kind of services, it's not possible to function adequately. So the question in my mind, and I don't know the answer to this, but I want to put it on the table for discussion, is what do we need in the area of social accountability, where companies take it upon themselves out of a sense of social responsibility to keep their systems clear of undesirable content or undesirable activities? To what extent should they be accountable to the larger society for taking those steps, and how should that pattern of accountability be developed?
So may I respond to that? As
Yeah,
Mark
sure.
probably assumes I would. I'm going to say something a little maybe controversial here, which is that, so in the US, we have a law commonly known as Section 230, and Section 230 says that internet intermediaries are not legally responsible for the bad behavior of their users. So if I go on YouTube and I post something defamatory about someone, YouTube can't be sued for what I've done. I can still be sued, but YouTube can't be sued. And the proposition I would put out there is that this law has actually been more important, well, as important, if not more important, for protecting free expression in this country than the First Amendment, or Article 19 under the human rights system, or any human rights standard out there. And the reason is this.
And not just in this country.
Not just in this country, I would say that. And I would say that actually the proposition that intermediaries should be protected from liability for the bad behavior of users was most recently reaffirmed in the OECD Internet Policymaking Principles as a best practice to promote the free flow of information and free expression. And if you think about it, I mean, it's pretty simple if you think about the speed at which communication flows on the network and the tools that we use every day, which are largely owned and operated by private companies, right? So if YouTube or Facebook or pick your social media company of choice had to be responsible and worry about liability arising from all of the millions of users that use their systems every day, they probably couldn't operate. On YouTube alone, to use Bob's statistic and to steal his thunder, 48 hours of video are posted on YouTube.
Well, 60 now.
Oh, sorry. 60 hours of YouTube video are posted on YouTube every minute. We now have 3,000 photos posted every second on Facebook. And this number's probably low because it's from 2010, but 160,000 tweets are sent every minute. And so if you think about that and the obligations that could be put on these providers that some countries are beginning to think about, it would be really difficult for these really incredibly potent and powerful platforms for expression to really exist. So I think I would put that out there. The other thing I wanted to say briefly is that I want to make one distinction when we talk about responsibility of companies. Because when we talk about intermediary responsibility, it's often the case that the context is a government is saying, okay, Facebook, we see all these really horrible things being posted on Facebook that we don't like, that violate our local law. Facebook, we want you to do something about it. And a government is putting a mandate on Facebook. I think that's a very different set of responsibilities and creates very different incentives than the kind of responsibility we were talking about this morning under the principles like the Global Network Initiative's principles, where the company is being asked by governments to help with surveillance or help with censorship. And the GNI is really about what is the responsibility of those companies to then respect the rights of users in pushing back against those kinds of requests. So I think just to separate those two out distinctly, I think is important to keep in mind.
You know, I think those are really, they're very important points, but one of the challenges you have, and I think Ben alluded to it earlier, is that I think that it's very important when you talk about what countries are, how countries are looking at the internet and making decisions, that that you may have a different view, but you can't say that their concerns are not legitimate.
Absolutely.
Because to the extent that they represent what they believe is their home audience and their home laws. So the question is not to necessarily attack their legitimacy, but talk about, is there a better standard to move toward? That's where I think the real challenge is when I talk to not only companies but also challenge to public interest groups, because in order to make the case that the standard should be different, how the local government views the world may not be the best. But what's interesting challenge, and Ben also was very diplomatic, is that I think there are a lot of people who are surprised that the kind of challenges to openness are not necessarily coming from some of just, for example, totalitarian regimes. They're coming from countries that are friends of ours, that look like us, and that we think feel like us, but they believe legitimate and different views about how to control the environment.
And they're coming masked in perfectly justifiable terms, which are child pornography, for example. So the Australians decide that they're going to develop a great system to essentially filter content, and they do it in the name of child pornography. Now, thank God it doesn't go anywhere, but nonetheless, it's a...
But they went further. They said that it's not only child pornography, which everybody agrees to, but anything that we happen not to like.
Basically.
So what's the standard there? So those are interesting but not illegitimate questions.
No.
I think surveillance actually presents a more compelling case, because every single government has a need to investigate crime, to prosecute crime, and to protect victims. And there is a need for some amount of surveillance in order to do that. But the question then becomes, what are the standards that safeguard user privacy? When do you determine when it's legitimate to surveil or when it's legitimate to get access to stored data? I think those are the key questions. And I think that's really the challenge, is identifying what are those best practices and then making the case for those best practices to our friends and allies.
You're right, because one of the challenges I see out there is that it's not only between countries where you have differences of views, you have really strong differences of views within countries. So that they have not determined in some cases what they believe the country view is going forward in some of these areas. And that presents an interesting challenge. My question, though, is, do you think what the OECD proposes is a more global set of policy making? Do you think that will improve the situation or make it worse?
I mean, my view is that the OECD principles are a good start, right? I mean, I want to make it clear that there are no easy answers here, and the OECD doesn't answer every single question. What it does do is give a set of guidelines to at least start guiding the thinking and the discussion around what are the right policies that both protect user privacy and meet legitimate government needs for law enforcement investigation. How can governments both enforce their local content laws without undermining the openness? I think if you look at the principles, they are at the level of guidelines, and I think it's the start of the discussion.
We're going to have to go to questions soon, but before we do, I want to pose one other question for you. It's this. One of the things that hasn't been talked about today is this concept of innovation. That
Oh God, I'm so tired of that word.
Use a new one.
Okay.
No, it's just a word that's
Right.
used over and over again, and nobody knows what it means.
Well, that's what one of
means
the
something
things
different to
I
each
find
person.
really interesting here is that when people start talking about the free flow of information, they say it's important for innovation, okay? And that they try to get countries to think maybe outside the box by saying it will have a positive effect on innovation.
No.
Is this true?
I'll give you an example. If by innovation, and this is where the word might mean something different to different people, if by innovation you mean the development of new companies with ideas that hadn't been tried before, or business models that hadn't been tried before. Think of cloud computing as an enabler of that kind of stuff. So cloud computing takes computing resources, and instead of requiring startup companies to invest heavily in massive amounts of computer equipment and resources and software in order to get off the ground, what it does is to say, you can rent what you need at a price that is related to your usage. So as you start off, you don't have to buy all this investment. You can just treat it as an operating expense instead of a huge capital expense. So how does this relate to free flow of information? If the cheapest and the best cloud computing provider is offshore, right, then a domestic entrepreneur who wants to get the cheapest and best way of providing these computer resources at the lowest possible price will want the free flow of information to get access to that cloud computing provider. So cloud computing providers rely on the free flow of information to reach customers throughout the world, and conversely, new innovative startup companies in developing countries rely on the best possible cloud computing operations to begin and to start and to grow and to develop. And that's one way in which the free flow of information is connected to innovation.
I think Bob's frustration, which I share, essentially reflects the fact that, and my title is Policy Advisor for Innovation, which is convenient for me because it doesn't mean anything, or it means everything. To my mind, innovation is not an object, it's a modifier. Innovative what? In this context, I think innovation is sort of often used as a code for money. Mm-hmm. What it means is innovative business practices, as in those business practices which will bring in revenues which were heretofore not there. That's what it means. Mm-hmm. And I think there's an understanding at some level that technology is, in fact, a catalyst for economic growth, mm-hmm. and there's data to prove it. I don't think that's much in dispute. To me, that this question of innovation, in some ways, goes to this high-level discussion of what is internet freedom about and why is it important. Because the sort of underlying theme that we haven't addressed in this discussion is how do you persuade other countries to move in a particular direction? Well, I see sort of two simultaneous tracks going on all the time. One is, what are your goals? What are the high-level things you would like to achieve? Is it human rights and freedom of expression? Is it innovation and economic growth? Is it free flow of information? Is it access to knowledge? Is it better education and public services? What are the goals that you would like this network to achieve for your country? At which point, then you back down and try to establish policies which will help realize those goals. And when you do that, you get into the second track, which is sort of the messy business of figuring out how to craft policies which are consistent with other competing values, but will also get you to those goals. Mm-hmm. And this is where thresholds and process and transparency become key to try to manage the inevitable conflicts between different countries,
right,
about where they come down on this question. But I think that the reason why big picture discussions of innovation and first principles like freedom of expression are important is because in a lot of cases for countries who haven't really considered internet policy before, the goals are still being shaped. And there's no consensus about what the ideal is for 20 years down the road when the internet has developed into a more mature technology with higher penetration rates mm-hmm. in that society. Mm-hmm. And it always surprises me on my travels to find people in very senior positions in government and private sector and academia who essentially deny that the internet is a net benefit to humanity mm-hmm. and see it as a problem that needs to be controlled
Absolutely.
And put in a box.
Yep. Absolutely.
And so the discussion of innovation essentially is in opposition to that notion that closed is better than open.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because are you seeing more and more in your travels and discussions the sense that no matter what, there's a certain inevitability to it. There is going to be change and technology is going to have some role in it.
Sure. Everywhere you go, mm-hmm. you hear this. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious. Last week I spent a couple of days with 35-odd That's about 35, not odd. They're perfectly nice and normal.
Diplomacy.
Ambassadors to the UN Human Rights Council discussing these issues. And I want to get back to the question of their bottom line was not, their bottom line was about legitimacy in government and where government has legitimate concerns. And that takes us back to where we were in the first part of the discussion.
Sure.
And you had to say to them, as Cynthia did, we believe government has legitimate concerns in the following areas, but don't kill the internet. Don't make a mistake. Don't overreach. Because the minute you overreach with it is the minute you're going to kind of tear the heart out of it.
But just to be provocative and present one hard case in all this is that China's really presented the counter model, right?
Yeah.
China has shown that you can have a vibrant domestic internet industry, expand internet access throughout your country, allow a little more speech and a little more access to information without fundamentally undermining your political power. And I think a lot of governments in the middle are really looking at essentially these two models on the other side, saying, well, where do we want to go, and which will better serve our interests, essentially. And so I think that's a challenge that we're going to have to contend with.
Especially because we're still at the beginning. We still have a lot to see. So on that note, maybe it's a good time to see if people have questions. Sure. The one thing I'm going to ask, because that we're being recorded, is that if you're speaking, would you identify yourself and where you're from?
Adam Powell from the University of Southern California. This is for Bob. You say that you're concerned now with these middle countries. Can you point to one or two examples where the debate or the discussion is at a critical moment right now in Brazil, Indonesia, the Philippines, wherever?
India. India is the kind of number one place I would point to at the moment. I think it's gone past a critical point in Korea. It's a country that gives me nightmares. I think we're reaching a critical point in Russia. The more you see political opposition, especially given the, should we say, mobocracy that controls the Russian economy. You may soon be paying large licensing fees in Russia to strange people who don't sit behind government doors in order to let yourself be heard on the internet. That's just a guess. But those are some countries that I'd identify. Brazil always worries me simply because there are lots of prosecutors running around trying to make names for themselves in a very large country. And foreign companies are easy targets.
Sure. There's some other.
Hi, for the panel, can you give some...
Who are you?
Luke Pelican with the Moore Group. Could you provide some commentary on the EU's proposed privacy directive and what effects that might have on sort of preserving and trying to continue to pursue this open internet and the values that we get from it? Thanks.
Don't look at me.
Who wants to touch that one?
Well, let me jump in with some general comments. First of all, it's a proposal. It's not a final document. It's got a couple of years at least of consideration in the European Union institutions. The proposal that was released on January 25th suffers from two big issues that I want to draw attention to. One is their proposal for a right to be forgotten seems to be a step too far. There is a legitimate right to be forgotten issue out there. If a company has got your information and you want to tell them to delete it, you should be able to tell them to delete it. Or if you want to move it to a different provider, you should be able to tell them to move it to a different provider. But the idea that information that's widely distributed on the internet should be subject to a deletion button is impractical, and to the extent that it calls for that, we think it's probably got some problems with respect to the free flow of information. And the second is the requirement in many circumstances for explicit consent. That creates difficulties for the the sort of advertising and other economic functions of the internet. Those two issues, I think, are the primary ones. They're more detailed ones. And as the discussions go forward, we expect U.S. policymakers, European policymakers, European businesses to engage in a lengthy discussion on the best way to go forward.
I also see one irony here, and that is the dilemma between the demand for privacy and the demand for data retention, which is something that governments are going to have to come to some internal agreement on. Because on the one hand, they say protect everybody's privacy and give them extra controls. And on the other hand, they come to companies and they say, we must have the information about this person, and you must hold this information for 9 months or 18 months or whatever it happens to be in that jurisdiction. That is a very difficult nut to crack.
Sure.
Steve Winters, local researcher. One problem I'm having with the discussion is when you use the term the internet, I mean, it seems like we're talking about some well-defined thing. Since I go back to, say, the early 90s with the internet, I can remember the worldwide traffic in, say, 91 was something like 1 or 2 terabytes of the whole internet. I mean, that's ridiculous from talking about the internet today. So, given that, I think there's an interesting book by Tim Wu where he looks at various communications technologies and argues that in the past, every one has fallen under some kind of monopolistic control, television, so forth and so on. Anybody can read the book. And his great fear is that the internet might be susceptible to the same development. And certainly there was a period several years ago when people talked about the AOLization of the net, and it looked like maybe AOL was going to become the internet. Now it looks like maybe Facebook's going to become the internet, unless perhaps they're sidetracked by Google, who seems to have caught on to what they're trying to do. So the issue is, when you talk about the global internet, does this just mean that the U.S. policy is going to be every country has to accept Facebook as the internet?
Maybe I should, I'll answer the policy question. The short answer is no. I think, in our view, the internet is the physical infrastructure of networks connected to one another that stretch across the globe that make it possible for any person connected in any geographic location in the world to have the same experience in terms of access to information and connectivity to other users, no matter where they are. What dominant services are in particular market segments at any given time are, to my mind, a separate track from that, except insofar as they seek to gain control over the physical infrastructure and manage it in such a way that it favors particular commercial or political interests. And there have been a variety of debates about that, both domestically and internationally. So I think there is a role for policymakers in this space, but the role for policymakers is to try to steer the ship towards open and to try to continue to engage the multi-stakeholder process which generated the internet and which has done a remarkably good job of keeping together this amorphous political economic landscape, which is networks located in every country in the world with users with different habits and desires about what they want to use the internet for. So I think you're right to point out that there are certainly centralizing tendencies in the applications market these days, but we've seen these things go in patterns over time, and I expect as the next 2 billion people who connected the internet are largely not in North America or Europe, you will see the rise of very popular applications and services that none of us have ever heard of today.
Hi, Kathy Sloan, CCIA. I was just wondering if, to Ben's point on innovative what, that the problem with our use of the word innovation in the U.S. has to do with the fact that our rules of civic engagement and governance and politics are pretty well set. And in those middle countries, the worst thing that could happen to the government is innovative civic engagement and innovative politics and government.
this is the reason why internet freedom is so often, in my view, very mistakenly equated with a policy of regime change. Because political movements organized online are headline-grabbing, world-shaking events. But the reality is that the internet is politically agnostic. It enables people to realize their desires no matter what they may be. The vast majority of people, when they connect, the internet enables them to do such things as share pictures of their family with relatives who live elsewhere, make cheap phone calls, watch YouTube videos of cats playing the piano. It is an entertainment and personal communications medium. Only a very tiny minority of activity on the internet has to do with political speech. So I think that the key point in internet freedom is that it is up to the user to decide how they want to use this technology. And what happens when they use it will be that whatever they want to achieve will be enabled by that. If they want political change, it will enable them to advocate for political change. If they want to change the entertainment options, it will enable them to do that. And if they want to start a new business and become an innovative inventor of new technologies and services, it will enable them to do that. And to me, that's the bedrock of internet freedom, and why it poses both these opportunities and vulnerabilities for every government in the world, including ours.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think one of the best arguments to make, especially to markets like India, maybe the terminology is wrong, maybe innovation is the right word, right? That's right. Right, but it's really about, look, you have a really vibrant, burgeoning internet industry, you want to be globally competitive. There's a set of policies that can help you ensure that your local industry grows, that it can be competitive, that it competes, that you have lots of innovation and lots of growth in your domestic market. And I think that's a really strong argument for a lot of those middle countries.
And let's talk about one other definition of innovation. Let's talk about the Chinese definition of indigenous innovation, which might be called stealing from other countries. Might be.
Ben, I agree with your point, and I think, and it comes back to something I read about that Cynthia has pointed out in something she's written. If you start talking about what the future is going to look like, a lot of these new technologies, whether social technologies, they are agnostic, but they're not really designed to be merely communications. They're about engagement. So the challenge that you're going to see is how countries in the middle, even countries on either side, are going to be on these platforms, using these technologies, and how they choose to engage with anyone out there. That's going to be very interesting to see, and we're only at the beginning of that.
Ann Nelson, Columbia University, and I write reports on media assistance for the National Endowment for Democracy. Recently, both the State Department and USAID have looked at their media assistance budgets and decided to direct some of these budgets to the area of internet freedom. I was wondering if those new programs could be described and along with some of the philosophies behind them and where this field might be going.
Let me answer in broad strokes because I'm not sure exactly what programs you're referring to, but I think I understand your point. As far as I have seen, the USAID media assistance programs that have been brought under the Internet Freedom umbrella are about helping people learn how to use the internet to achieve whatever goals they may have. In large part, that is journalism training. That is teaching people how to use the internet as citizen reporters and leverage the fact that now you have a network where anybody with a smartphone can become a citizen reporter. And you see really remarkable journalistic enterprises happening all over the world, which are essentially crowdsourced. You send out a large number of people to report on a major event like an election or a natural disaster or a social movement, and you get huge amounts of content coming from lots of different places. How do you manage that in such a way that people have presented in a journalistically responsible way to appeal to a larger audience? I think a lot of the media assistance work program towards the internet is about digital literacy, and it's about understanding the role of journalism and the possibilities for journalism in the internet age.
I think that we're almost at the end. I know we promised to keep people here, and I know there's some people who didn't get to ask their question, but I'm going to exercise one prerogative as moderator. I want to ask the last question, okay? And it's this. All right, you're here just among friends. Tell me what you see is coming next. What do you think we're going to be looking for in the next year to 18 months that's going to be really important in this area?
I think the key development is the smartphone. As 3G and 4G networks are deployed to more and more countries, which is happening so quickly, it's hard to keep track of all of the developments in that marketplace. More and more people connect to the internet for the first time. That is going to up the stakes on both sides of the ledger of opportunity and vulnerability. And on the one hand, there are going to be a whole lot more people expressing their grievances, both politically and socially, as well as taking advantage of entertainment and personal communications options. But there's also going to be a whole lot more money on the table for pushing policies in a direction of attracting investment and global business that's looking for new markets, where you've got an emerging base of internet users. So I would look for countries with rapid growth rates in internet connectivity to be dealing with these questions faster and in a more aggressive timetable, and with perhaps a higher temperature in the debate than in other places.
Good point.
Oh, you're looking at me.
No, you're drinking. Go ahead.
I'm fine. I'm going to astonishingly agree and say that whatever we see in the next 12 to 18 months is going to be in the mobile sphere. And that anybody who's looking at what's next in, quote unquote, the internet, or the internets, depending upon your generation, I think you have to look towards the handheld device and where that's going and what it's going to allow people to do in everyday commerce, in organizing for social and political change, and in free expression.
What do you think?
Well, rather than agree with my colleagues, and I do, I'll raise something that hasn't been raised so much so far here, which is the issue of internet governance and how the internet will be governed moving forward. Up until now, the internet has largely been governed in a very decentralized and a very open, bottom-up and multi-stakeholder way. There's no one global internet body or governance body or regulatory body for the internet. There are a number of different countries that are trying to change that in various venues, and I think the one to look out for in the next year is the International Telecommunications Union, whose mandate up until now has mostly been around traditional telecom issues, but there is pressure on the ITU to open up its jurisdiction to bring in the internet within it. And I would note that China and Russia really would like to see the creation of a global regulatory body housed in some UN body itself to govern the internet. And it's two countries that have a very different vision for what the internet will look like in 10 years than perhaps some of us in this room might share. So,
Thank you. Mark, you get the last word.
So I agree with the mobile as the big development in the coming 12 to 18 months. Although I do think this issue of who's going to control the internet, this ITU issue, is a close second. But on the mobile issue, I look at a different issue as the one that's likely to be the most important for internet freedom, and that's the role of the platform provider. The platform provider, in some connections, can make decisions about what information is available, what apps are available. They can make decisions that have substantial effect on the economic potential of the medium, as well as its potential for free expression. And we have a conflict between two business models. One, very, very open, let the world do what it wants. and one more or less closed, where we need to get permission from the platform provider to move forward. I think that that conflict between the two business models may not have direct policy implications, but it's going to have important implications for both business development and for free expression.
Well, thank you very much. Those were great comments. Please give our panelists a hand. And thank you very much for coming. I'll make one other plug for Andy and the folks at MAP, that we appreciate you coming to these events. We think that they shine a spotlight in some areas that maybe don't get enough attention. And so, welcome. We hope you come again, and we hope you will find a way to support MAP in the things that we do. So thank you very much for coming.